She stood in the rain in a dirty wedding dress, unwanted by anyone, until a farmer drove by in an old pickup truck. What happened afterward, no one could have predicted. Subscribe in the comments where you're watching from. The rain had been falling since dawn, drumming softly on the high windows of the Langford estate, as if nature itself had sensed the weight of a day that should have been joyful. Beneath the grand chandelier, florists moved with urgency, arranging centerpieces of white roses and ivory lilies while caterers filed past in pressed uniforms. The marble floors gleamed, the crystal glasses sparkled. The air was heavy with the scent of perfume, expectation, and pressure. Upstairs, in the farthest room of the second floor, Emma Langford stood still, a vision of bridal elegance draped in silk and lace. The dress fit perfectly, tailored to flatter every line of her tall, willowy frame. Her hair, swept into a graceful chignon, held steady with jeweled pins. A veil of tulle cascaded behind her, light as breath. Yet her reflection in the mirror seemed like a stranger. She could hear voices downstairs, her mother barking orders, her father charming a state senator, the distant sound of a string quartet rehearsing in the garden pavilion. But none of it felt real. "Stop fidgeting," her mother said briskly, tugging on the edge of the veil with a practiced hand. "The press will be here in an hour. Do you want to look anxious in the photos?" Emma didn't answer. She had mastered silence long ago, had learned that emotions were best left buried beneath charm and good posture. But her heart wasn't just uneasy, it was screaming. Her breath came shallowly. Her palms were damp despite the cool air from the ceiling fan. Her mother stepped back, surveying her daughter with a calculating eye. "You look perfect," she said, as if Emma were a porcelain doll on display. "Every woman in this state would kill to be in your shoes. Remember that." Emma blinked slowly and gave the polite nod expected of her. Inside, the scream was getting louder. Her fiancé, Nathan Prescott, had arrived earlier that morning in a black limousine with tinted windows. A man of impeccable manners, expensive suits, and cold eyes. He had kissed her cheek mechanically, told her she looked elegant, then disappeared into the study with her father. Emma hadn't seen him since. She had overheard them talking through the closed doors about a golf course deal, about campaign donations, about profit margins. No one had spoken to her about love. It was nearing 11 when she finally escaped to the adjoining bathroom and locked the door behind her. She sat on the edge of the tub, her veil still clinging to her shoulders like a net. The silence inside that small tiled room was louder than the chaos outside. Her hands trembled as she reached up to remove her earrings. One fell into the sink and clattered down the drain. Her breathing quickened. She looked in the mirror again, closer this time. Her eyes, once filled with dreams of art and travel and books read in sunlit cafes, now looked dull. Her lips, painted in the perfect nude shade, trembled slightly. She realized, with a sudden surge of panic, that she could not do this. She could not walk down that aisle and vow her life to a man she barely knew, under the gaze of people who didn't see her as anything but a strategic union. Her fingers found the back zipper of the dress. The metal teeth resisted for a moment, but then gave way. She stepped out of the gown carefully, 1 foot at a time, like she was shedding a skin. In its place, she pulled on a soft cotton blouse and a pair of faded jeans, clothes she'd hidden beneath a pile of designer bags in the closet days ago, just in case. She moved quickly now. Her fingers no longer trembled. She took a small leather backpack from the back of her wardrobe, stuffed it with essentials: cash, Idaho, a change of clothes. She tied her hair into a loose braid and slipped on sneakers. No one noticed her leave. The Langford estate had several side entrances, one of which led to the old greenhouse near the garage. From there, she made her way past the wrought iron gates, ducking behind a hedge when a security guard appeared. The rain had turned steady now, soaking her braid, clinging to her blouse. She welcomed the cold. It reminded her that she was alive. She hailed a taxi from the edge of the road, giving the driver the address of the nearest train station. He looked her over briefly in the mirror, but said nothing, just nodded and turned up the windshield wipers. At the station, she bought a one-way ticket to a small town she had never heard of. It was 3 hours away and nestled somewhere in the middle of the state. She chose it because the name sounded quiet, unassuming, like the kind of place where no one would ask questions. The train was nearly empty. She found a seat by the window and pulled her hood over her head. Outside, the city blurred into fields, into stretches of green, into pockets of forest. The rain traced lines across the glass, mirroring the ones she had wiped from her own face in the bathroom mirror. Emma stared at her hands. They were clean now, but she could still feel the weight of the diamond ring she had left behind on the vanity. She had taken it off before leaving and placed it next to a note. 5 words scrawled in haste, but with clarity. "I'm sorry, I can't do this." The further the train took her, the more she exhaled. By the time it pulled into the small rural station, evening had begun to settle. The platform was quiet, and only a few passengers disembarked. The air smelled of wet earth and wood smoke. Emma stepped down carefully, her sneakers splashing into a shallow puddle. She had no umbrella. Her backpack was heavy on her shoulders, but it was the weight of choice, not burden. There was no one waiting for her. She followed the only road leading from the station, a cracked strip of asphalt flanked by fields and low fences. A few scattered houses dotted the hills in the distance, their lights glowing faintly through the mist. She walked for a long time, unsure of where she was going. The sky had turned a deep shade of blue, and the rain had begun again, this time softer, steadier. She was cold. Her feet ached. Her hands had gone numb, but she didn't stop. Not until a pair of headlights appeared in the distance. They moved slowly, deliberately, not like the roaring city cars she was used to. As the truck approached, Emma stepped off the road slightly, unsure whether to wave or hide. The vehicle came to a stop beside her. The driver's window rolled down. "You all right?" The voice was low, calm, and lined with concern. She turned to face him. A man in his late 30s, perhaps early 40s, sat behind the wheel. His features were tanned and weathered, the kind that spoke of long days under the sun. His eyes were clear, quiet. He wore a flannel shirt, sleeves rolled up, hands resting loosely on the wheel. Emma hesitated. "I'm just passing through," she said, her voice hoarse. He nodded slowly. "You need a place to get dry?" She said nothing, but the answer was in her shivering. The passenger door opened with a creak. She climbed in, settling into the worn seat. The heater blew warm air that smelled faintly of hay and coffee. He didn't ask her name. She didn't offer it. The drive was short, down a gravel path, past a small orchard, and up to a modest farmhouse that stood like a sentinel against the storm. The porch light was on. A dog barked once in the distance, then fell silent. Inside, the house was plain but warm. Wooden floors, a stone fireplace, a kitchen that looked lived in. He handed her a towel, gestured toward a pair of clean socks, and said she could take the spare room. She nodded, still unable to speak. That night, Emma lay in a bed that creaked with every breath, beneath quilts that smelled of cedar and thyme. The storm raged outside, but within those walls there was peace. Not the kind that came from silence, but the kind that came from not having to pretend. She didn't know the man's name. He didn't know hers. And yet, for the first time in years, she felt safe. Emma woke to the faint sound of wind chimes tapping gently against the porch railing. The rain had softened during the night but still lingered in the form of mist that curled over the window pane, blurring the view of the early morning fields beyond. For a moment, she lay still, wrapped in thick quilts that smelled of lavender and old pine, the unfamiliar quiet of the farmhouse surrounding her like a cocoon. The mattress was uneven, the bedsheets mismatched, but it was the most restful sleep she had had in years. She sat up slowly, muscles sore from the strain of the previous day. Her clothes, which she had hung carefully over the back of a wooden chair, were still damp. On the floor beside her backpack sat a neatly folded flannel shirt and a pair of clean jeans, clearly not hers, but placed there with quiet intention. Emma hesitated before picking them up, pressing the fabric to her face. They carried the scent of hay, soap, and something steadying she couldn't quite name. Downstairs, the house creaked softly with age, but it was not an eerie sound. It was the sound of life. She followed the smell of coffee and the gentle clatter of pans into the kitchen. The man who had picked her up the night before stood at the stove, turning something in a skillet with a wooden spatula. He glanced over his shoulder when he heard her enter, giving a slight nod. "Morning," he said, his voice even. "Good morning," she replied, her throat still hoarse, though warmer than it had been the night before. He handed her a mug of coffee without ceremony, then returned to flipping the eggs. The table was old, scratched and worn smooth by years of use. A small jar of wildflowers sat at its center. Emma sat down, wrapping her hands around the mug, letting the warmth seep into her fingers. "I didn't know if you'd be heading out first thing," he said, "but you're welcome to stay and dry off some more if you like." "I don't really have a destination," she admitted, staring into her cup. "Not anymore." He didn't press her. Instead, he placed a plate of eggs and toast in front of her and poured himself a cup of coffee. They ate in silence, but it wasn't strained. It was the kind of silence that made room for thought, for breath. She appreciated that he didn't fill it with forced questions or assumptions. "My name's Alex," he said eventually. "Emma," she said. He nodded once, and that was that. After breakfast, Emma offered to wash the dishes, needing to keep her hands busy. Alex didn't argue. The farmhouse kitchen was simple. Open shelves instead of cabinets, jars of dried herbs, a window that framed the backyard like a painting. Chickens pecked in the damp grass near a red wooden coop, and beyond them, low fences bordered a stretch of field that disappeared into the fog. Alex pulled on his boots and grabbed a weathered denim jacket from a hook near the door. "Got to check the barn. Animals still need feeding, rain or no." Emma hesitated, then surprised herself by asking, "Can I help?" He paused, then shrugged. "If you don't mind getting muddy." "I don't," she said, and meant it. She borrowed a pair of rubber boots from a line by the door and followed him outside. The air was cool and clean, the kind of clean that made her lungs ache with the unfamiliarity of it. Rain still fell in a fine mist, dotting her eyelashes and soaking into her braid. The mud pulled at her boots as they crossed the yard to the barn. Inside, the barn smelled of straw and animals, a comforting, earthy scent. Cows shuffled in their stalls and a trio of goats bleated in greeting. Alex moved with practiced efficiency, scooping feed, checking water, brushing one of the horses with long, steady strokes. Emma watched for a moment, then rolled up her sleeves and joined him. The pitchfork felt awkward in her hands, but he gave her no instruction, only let her figure it out on her own. It was hard work, but satisfying. Each task had a clear purpose: feed this, clean that, close this gate. There was no pretense, no performance, just action and its immediate consequence. By the time they were done, her arms ached, her back was sore, and her hands were flecked with dirt. She had never felt so grounded. They returned to the house in silence, rain dripping from their jackets. Alex disappeared into another room, and Emma retreated to the bathroom to scrub the mud from her skin. The house had only one small bathroom with a clawfoot tub and a cracked mirror above a porcelain sink. She stared at her reflection again, surprised by the change. Her cheeks were flushed, hair damp and curling around her face. She looked real. That afternoon, Alex showed her around the property. The farmhouse stood on a piece of land that stretched over 60 acres. Fields, some fallow, others sprouting early green, a vegetable garden in the back, a modest orchard to the east. There was an old chicken coop, a workshop with rusted tools hung meticulously on the wall, and a shed filled with beekeeping supplies that hadn't been used in years. The place bore signs of a life lived in quiet dedication. "This was my parents' farm," Alex said as they walked. "I took over after my dad passed. My wife helped me run it until she got sick. Been managing on my own since." Emma didn't ask more. She felt the grief tucked beneath those words like roots under soil, present, anchoring, but not immediately visible. Over the next few days, she stayed. Not because she was asked to, and not because she had nowhere else to go, though both were technically true, but because something about the farm's rhythm made her feel like she belonged to herself again. She woke early with the sun, helped in the barn, learned to knead dough, collect eggs, and hang laundry on a line that snapped in the breeze. Her body grew stronger, her skin rougher, her mind quieter. Alex never asked about her past, and she never volunteered it. He spoke little, but when he did, his words were deliberate, honest. In his company, Emma felt a rare safety, one that came not from protection, but from acceptance. He treated her not as a fragile thing, but as a capable equal, trusting her to handle tools, carry buckets, make decisions. One morning, she was sitting on the back steps sipping coffee when he came around from the workshop holding a bundle of wooden stakes. He nodded towards the overgrown patch beside the vegetable garden. "Was thinking of planting something there. You interested?" She smiled. "Yes, I think I am." They worked together through the afternoon, clearing rocks, breaking soil. He taught her how to space rows, how to plant with care, not force. They didn't say much, but the silence between them had deepened into something companionable. That night, over stew and cornbread, Emma found herself laughing, really laughing, for the first time in months. Alex looked up, surprised, and she caught the faintest glimmer of a smile in return. She slept more soundly that night than she had since childhood, and so the days passed, not in dramatic revelations or sweeping emotions, but in steady, meaningful moments. She learned the farm's rhythms, and slowly the farm began to learn her. The chickens followed her for scraps. The barn cat began to nap on her lap during breaks. She even coaxed a stubborn goat into letting her lead it to pasture. The rain came and went, and with it, the early signs of spring began to peek through the soil. Wildflowers dotted the edge of the fields, the orchard buds thickened, the air grew warmer, and the sky opened more often. Emma no longer thought about the wedding, the dress, or the polished halls of the estate. That life seemed far away now, like a story she had read once but didn't care to revisit. She had no idea where this road would lead her. She didn't know how long she would stay, but each morning, when she stepped out into the light and saw the mist rising from the fields, when she felt the dirt under her nails and the ache in her muscles, when she heard Alex's calm voice nearby, she knew she was exactly where she needed to be. The sun was barely peeking over the horizon when Emma stepped outside, the dew clinging to the grass like thousands of tiny diamonds. Her breath puffed in the morning air as she tugged the sleeves of her borrowed flannel tighter around her wrists. The scent of damp earth and wood smoke greeted her like a familiar friend. It had been nearly 2 weeks since she arrived on Alex's farm, and though she had stopped counting the days, her body had begun to adjust to the quiet rhythm of rural life. There were no alarms, no calendars, no urgent messages blinking on a screen. Here, time passed in sunrises and the shifting weight of seasons. Each morning began with chores: feed the chickens, check the water lines, collect eggs, and sweep the barn aisle. Tasks that had once felt foreign now held a strange comfort. She no longer flinched at the feel of mud clinging to her boots or hay sticking to her jeans. Her hands, once manicured and smooth, bore small cuts and calluses. The skin beneath her nails darkened with soil that refused to be washed away. And yet she had never felt more real. Alex never hovered. He showed her how to do things once, then trusted her to handle it. He moved through his world with quiet confidence, fixing fences with the same care he used to tend the orchard. He rarely offered praise, but he never criticized either. It was this subtle trust, this absence of performance, that made Emma want to earn her place here, not through charm or obedience, but through effort, through presence. She began rising earlier each day, slipping out before the sun crested the hills, often starting work before Alex came down from his room. She would have the kettle boiling by the time he entered the kitchen, and sometimes he would grunt his approval when he saw the eggs already frying on the stove. These moments were small, almost invisible to an outsider, but they filled her with a quiet pride. She didn't want thanks. She only wanted to feel like she belonged somewhere that wasn't borrowed or bought. By the 3rd week, Emma had begun exploring the land on her own. Alex had shown her the old walking trail that wound through the woods at the edge of the orchard. It led to a narrow stream with mossy banks and a broken wooden bench that looked as though it had once been part of a storybook scene. She often brought her journal there, the one she had tucked into her bag during the escape. Pages that had once held only aimless sketches and quotes were now filled with lists, seed types, crop rotations, notes about the goat's behavior, ideas for improving the chicken coop. One afternoon, while they worked together clearing a patch of overgrown brambles near the tool shed, Emma nicked her palm on a sharp branch. The pain was immediate and stinging, blood beating along the cut. She hissed through her teeth and stepped back, pressing her thumb against the wound. Alex looked up from where he was working and walked over without a word. He took her hand gently, turning it to inspect the damage. Then, with quiet efficiency, he led her back into the house, cleaned the cut, and wrapped it with gauze. "You'll want gloves next time," he said simply, taping the edge of the bandage. "The brush fights back." Emma smiled through the sting. Lesson learned. He nodded and looked at her hand for a moment longer, his calloused fingers lingering just long enough for her to notice the warmth of his skin before he stepped away. Nothing more was said, but something had shifted in the silence between them. A quiet acknowledgement of care, not romantic, not dramatic, but human. As the days lengthened and the rains grew less frequent, Emma began taking more initiative. She repaired the old screen door that banged in the wind, organized the shed that had been in disarray for years, and even built a compost bin from scrap wood behind the barn. Alex watched her progress without interference, occasionally offering a tip or lending a hand, but mostly letting her make the space her own. He was not a man of compliments, but he left her small offerings: an extra cup of tea on the windowsill, a pair of new work gloves left on the porch steps, a folded note with a sketched map of the property she might use to find the creek beyond the orchard. She began to sleep more soundly. Her dreams were no longer filled with crowded ballrooms and sharp-tongued mothers. Instead, she dreamed of the smell of rain on tilled earth, of sunlight falling in stripes through the barn rafters, of laughter shared over chipped mugs at the kitchen table. Then came the day she met the photograph. She had been dusting the living room while Alex was out fixing the eastern fence line. It was a warm afternoon, and the open windows let in the scent of lilacs from the bush beside the porch. As she moved a stack of old books from the mantel, her fingers brushed against a small frame hidden behind them. Curious, she pulled it forward. It was a photograph of a woman, not much older than herself, with dark hair braided over one shoulder and eyes that smiled without effort. She stood beside Alex in front of the same house, both of them younger, sun-kissed, and effortlessly happy. The edges of the photograph were worn, the colors faded, but the emotion in it was unmistakable. Emma stared at the picture for a long time, feeling an ache she didn't fully understand. She hadn't asked about Alex's past, and he hadn't offered, but this image told her more than words could have. There had been love here, there had been loss. That evening, over dinner, she gently mentioned it. "I saw the photograph on the mantel." Alex looked at her for a long moment before nodding. "Her name was Lily. We were married 8 years. Cancer took her 3 winters ago." "I'm sorry," she said softly, unsure of what else to offer. "She liked to paint wildflowers, used to leave them on the porch when they bloomed," he added, almost as if speaking to himself. The silence that followed was not awkward, it was reverent. Emma felt the weight of it settle between them, not as a wall, but as something shared, something human. Later that week, when she found a cluster of wildflowers near the creek, she gathered a small bundle and placed them on the porch railing. She said nothing when Alex noticed them. He said nothing in return. But that evening, there was an extra plate of her favorite biscuits at dinner, and a new tin of her favorite tea appeared in the cupboard the next morning. Spring was slowly overtaking winter, and with it came the subtle promise of renewal. Emma began preparing a corner of the garden for planting, her fingertips tingling at the thought of new life taking root in this place where so much had once been lost. She wanted to grow something here, not just vegetables or herbs, but roots of her own. She had spent her whole life being groomed, not grown. Now, at last, she was beginning to unfurl. It was during one such afternoon in the garden, dirt streaked across her cheek and a spade in her hand, that a thought struck her with stunning clarity. She didn't want to leave. Not soon, not at all. She wasn't ready to name it, but it wasn't just the place or the piece. It was the way Alex handed her tools without asking. The way the animals had come to recognize her. The way the earth responded to her hands. The way the silence here didn't judge her. And perhaps, though she didn't yet dare say it aloud, it was the way Alex looked at her sometimes when she wasn't watching, not as someone fragile or pitiful or broken, but as someone capable, someone whole. She was still mending in places she didn't yet understand, but the dirt beneath her nails, the ache in her shoulders, the slowness of her breath, all of it told her she was healing. Not through escape, but through presence. By the time the first true warmth of spring settled into the valley, Emma had come to know the land intimately. She could predict the moment the sun would rise over the eastern ridge by the color of the sky through the attic window. She recognized the uneven beat of rain on the porch roof, the way the goats grew restless just before a storm. Her body, once accustomed to stillness, now thrived on the labor of the land. Her hands had toughened, her muscles firmed, and her back bore the ache of work done with purpose. But inside, a quiet unrest had begun to surface. It started subtly, like a change in air pressure before thunder. A missed chore here, a clumsy accident there, a pot left boiling too long, a gate not latched properly. Small things, all of them, but enough to stir something fragile in her chest. For all the peace she had found, there were days when doubt crept back in, slipping under the door like a draft. It whispered that she didn't belong, that this life was borrowed, that at any moment someone would knock at the door and tell her the masquerade was over. Emma tried to ignore it. She redoubled her efforts, rising earlier, staying outside later, pushing herself to exhaustion. But fatigue only sharpened the edges of her self-doubt. The perfectionism that had once been demanded of her now reawakened like a familiar ghost, whispering that unless she earned every inch of space, she had no right to claim it. One morning, while baking bread, she accidentally used salt instead of sugar in the dough. She didn't realize the mistake until she pulled the loaves from the oven and tasted a slice. Her stomach dropped, and she stared at the ruined bread, suddenly and irrationally overwhelmed. It was just bread. It didn't matter. And yet she felt the sting of tears behind her eyes. Alex walked into the kitchen just as she was dumping the loaves into the compost bin behind the house. He didn't say anything, only stood there, arms folded, watching her from the doorway. "I messed it up," she said too quickly, too defensively. "It's not a big deal." He looked at her for a long moment, then shrugged. "Happens." "I should have known better," she muttered, wiping her hands on a towel. "It was stupid." "Emma," he said gently, "it's bread." But it wasn't, not to her. That night, after dinner, she retreated to the room at the end of the hall, the one she had quietly claimed as her own, and sat in silence. The lamp cast a soft glow over the worn floorboards. Her journal lay open on the windowsill, but her pen remained still. Outside, the trees were budding, branches stretching cautiously into the light. Yet Emma sat unmoving, caught between seasons. She thought about the world she had left behind, the ornate chandeliers, the wine-stained laughter, the suffocating expectations stitched into every conversation. She remembered the way her mother had pursed her lips at the slightest imperfection, how her father had spoken in terms of investments and returns even when referring to people. Their love had been conditional, their approval a transaction. Here, no one measured her worth. And yet, she struggled to let go of the need to prove it. The next morning, she found herself lingering in the barn long after the chores were done, her fingers tracing idle patterns in the dust. The animals moved around her with easy familiarity. The rhythm of the farm hadn't changed, but her own sense of harmony had faltered. She was no longer sure if she was growing or simply surviving. That afternoon, while trying to haul a heavy bag of feed alone, she slipped and fell hard onto the ground. Pain shot through her wrist and the breath knocked out of her lungs. Alex found her minutes later sitting in the dirt, blinking back tears of frustration. "You trying to lift it all yourself?" he asked, kneeling beside her. "I thought I could manage." He examined her wrist, his hands careful and steady. "It's not broken, just bruised." "I should have asked for help," she murmured. He stood and offered her his hand. "It's okay to need help." She didn't take his hand right away. Her pride resisted, but her heart knew better. Eventually, she reached up. He pulled her to her feet with a gentleness that undid her more than any scolding ever could. Later, as she sat with her arm wrapped in a cold towel, Emma began to see the pattern. She had carried the weight of other people's expectations for so long she didn't know how to exist without them. Her fear of failure wasn't born on the farm. It was brought with her, packed alongside her escape. She began to speak more openly, to tell Alex when she didn't understand something, to laugh when she dropped a jar of preserves instead of hiding the broken glass. And with each moment of vulnerability, something inside her loosened. The turning point came on a cool, breezy morning in early April. Emma had volunteered to take a few donated goods to the local co-op. Alex hitched up the truck and she drove into town, her palms sweating on the wheel, though she didn't know why. The town was small, with only 2 main streets, a general store, and a cafe with chipped enamel tables out front. She parked in front of the co-op and carried the crates inside, smiling shyly at the woman behind the counter. "You're the one helping out at Alex's place, right?" the woman asked. She had silver hair and a voice like warm tea. "Yes," Emma said cautiously. The woman nodded, her smile widening. "He's a good one. Keeps to himself, but we all know his heart's big as this town." Emma flushed. "He's been kind." "Well, kindness isn't charity," the woman replied, handing her a receipt. "Kindness is recognizing something in someone and offering what you can." As Emma walked back to the truck, those words stayed with her. Kindness is recognizing something in someone. Maybe that's what Alex had done. Seen something in her that she herself hadn't yet acknowledged. The days that followed brought a different energy. Emma no longer tried to match some imagined standard. She simply showed up, fully present. When she burned the cornbread, she made toast instead. When she broke a rake handle, she found the tools and fixed it. She no longer rushed to fill silence with apologies. One evening, they stood together at the fence line, watching the sun dip behind the hills. The sky was lit in hues of gold and fire, and the trees swayed gently in the breeze. She leaned against the fence post, her shoulder brushing Alex's, and for the first time didn't flinch from the closeness. He turned to her, not with intensity, but with that quiet steadiness she had come to associate with safety. "You've changed since you got here," he said. Emma looked out over the fields. "I think I'm just starting to be who I've always been, without the noise." He didn't say anything more. He didn't need to. That night, she planted wildflower seeds in a corner of the garden near the porch. No neat rows, no measured perfection, just handfuls of color scattered into the soil like a promise. In the morning, she sat on the porch steps with her coffee and watched as the wind carried tiny petals from the blooming cherry tree across the yard. The land was awakening. And so was she, not with fanfare or declaration, but with quiet resolve. Emma understood now that healing wasn't a destination. It was a practice, a daily choice, to stay, to try, to let go. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't trying to escape. She was choosing to remain. The days had grown noticeably longer, stretching slowly into evenings laced with gold. A soft wind carried the scent of lilac and newly turned earth across the fields, and the orchard buzzed with the lazy energy of early bees drifting between blossoms. Emma stood in the garden with a trowel in hand, her palms smudged with soil and her brow damp with the kind of sweat that came not from strain, but from gentle, honest labor. The rows of lettuce and herbs were beginning to sprout, tender shoots reaching toward the sun. It was in these quiet rituals, digging, watering, watching, that she found her calm. The house, once a strange shelter, now breathed with a rhythm that felt like her own. She moved through it without hesitation. She knew which floorboards creaked before they gave. She knew the sharp whistle the kettle made when it boiled. She knew Alex's footsteps, the cadence of his work, the way he hummed softly under his breath when he thought no one was listening. They still spoke sparingly, but their silences were full. Words were exchanged where needed, but understanding often passed between them in glances, gestures, small acts of care. That morning, she had risen early and baked bread, this time with the right ingredients, and left 2 warm loaves cooling on the sill. Alex had taken one with him out to the fields without a word, though later she noticed a fresh bundle of lavender left at her place at the table. But even in the midst of this quiet happiness, something felt different that day. The sky was blue, the air was sweet, and yet Emma felt a restlessness curling beneath her skin. It was like the wind carried something unseen, an echo, a tension, the faint sense that the peace she had nurtured might not hold. The knock came mid-morning, not the kind of hesitant tapping she'd grown used to from neighbors or delivery drivers, but a firm, insistent sound that seemed to strike the door with purpose. Emma looked up from the sink where she'd been rinsing radishes, her hands still wet, the cool water slipping down her wrists. She crossed the room slowly, every instinct telling her something was wrong. When she opened the door, she stopped breathing. There, standing on the porch in a pressed navy suit and expensive Italian shoes, was her father. He looked older than she remembered, but only just. Silver at the temples, a deeper line between his brows. His posture remained proud, his expression practiced and composed, though his eyes held a sharpness that pierced through her like frost. "Emma," he said, as though it were a reprimand. She couldn't move, couldn't think. It was as if the air had been sucked out of her lungs. For a brief, dizzy moment, she wanted to slam the door and vanish back into the quiet life she had built. But the sight of him, the embodiment of everything she had fled, held her frozen in place. "I thought I made myself clear," she managed at last, her voice low. "I came to bring you home," he said evenly. "Your mother is—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Concerned." Emma laughed then, a short, humorless sound that startled even herself. "Concerned?" she echoed. "You mean embarrassed?" His jaw tightened. "This isn't a place for you, Emma. You're not a farmer's wife. You're a Langford. Your disappearance made headlines. Do you have any idea what kind of damage you've done to our reputation?" The words washed over her like dirty water. She stepped outside, closing the door softly behind her. "What I damaged," she said slowly, "was a lie, and I don't regret it." He looked past her then, toward the field where Alex was working near the barn, sleeves rolled up, his hat low over his eyes. "So, this is the man," he said, his tone flat. "This is what you chose." "I didn't choose him," she replied. "I chose myself." Her father scoffed. "Don't romanticize this, Emma. You're living in a fantasy, scraping your hands in the dirt, playing house on a rundown farm with some widowed drifter. It's beneath you." She felt something shift in her chest then, a burn, slow and steady. Not rage, not fear, just clarity. "You don't know anything about him," she said, "and you never really knew anything about me." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a white envelope. "I brought a plane ticket. There's still time to fix things. You can come back, make a public statement, say you were overwhelmed. People will forgive a temporary lapse in judgment. But if you stay here," his voice hardened, "you'll ruin what little chance you have left." Emma took the envelope in her hands and looked down at it for a long moment. It felt heavy, though it couldn't have weighed more than an ounce. She thought of marble floors and polite lies, of the choking pressure to perform and obey. She thought of the girl she had been in that satin dress, staring at her own reflection like a prisoner. Then she tore the envelope in half, and then again. Her father's face twisted in restrained fury. "You're making a mistake," he said. "Maybe," she replied, "but at least it's mine." He stepped back, as if struck. "He's using you. You know that, don't you? What else could a man like him want from a girl like you?" Emma didn't flinch. "Respect, which is more than I ever got from you." The words landed like a slap, but she didn't wait to see his reaction. She turned and walked back into the house, her heart pounding, her hands trembling. Alex was in the kitchen when she entered, leaning casually against the counter, his brow furrowed. He must have seen it all from the field. "He's gone," she said simply. Alex nodded. "You okay?" She nodded, then shook her head. "No, but I will be." He said nothing, just poured her a glass of water and set it on the table. She sat down, the room spinning slightly, her shoulders tense. It was over. Or rather, it had finally begun. Later that evening, when the sun dipped behind the trees and painted the sky in soft hues of orange and violet, Emma sat on the steps of the porch, her knees pulled up to her chest. The envelope pieces still lay in the trash, fragile and torn. She listened to the cicadas tuning their summer song and the distant clink of Alex tending to the tool shed. She closed her eyes and breathed deep. She hadn't realized how much of that old life still clung to her like a second skin. It wasn't just the clothes or the expectations, it was the fear. The idea that she was only worth as much as what others could gain from her, that she had to earn her place by pleasing people who never bothered to know her. Alex joined her on the steps, his presence quiet, steady. He handed her a small wooden box with a delicate clasp. "I was going to wait," he said, "but maybe now's the right time." She opened the box slowly. Inside was a key. Just a key. "It's for the barn," he said. "There's a small room I haven't used in years. Figured you might want to turn it into something." Emma stared at the key, something tightening in her throat. "Why me?" she asked softly. He looked out across the field. "Because this isn't about what you can do, or where you came from. It's about what you've chosen, and who you're becoming." That night, Emma didn't dream of her past. For the first time, she dreamed of something she had never dared to before. A future, one she would build with her own hands. The days that followed her father's visit passed with a clarity that surprised Emma. In the beginning, she'd expected to feel broken again, uncertain and shaken after their confrontation. But instead, something inside her had shifted. Subtly, at first, like the quiet tilting of the earth beneath new growth. The echo of his words lingered, yes, but it was no longer with the power to wound. They bounced off the walls of her mind like seeds that refused to take root. She had stood her ground. She had chosen herself. And now, for the first time in her life, she began to live without the shadow of someone else's blueprint. The small room in the barn, the one Alex had given her the key to, became her project. She cleaned it meticulously, stripping away years of dust and cobwebs, revealing rough wooden walls and a wide window that looked out over the pasture. The space had once been used as a storeroom, but she saw something else in it, a place of her own, not borrowed or inherited or disguised behind marble and chandeliers. She brought in a desk salvaged from the attic, sanded it down herself, and set it near the window. On the wall, she pinned sketches and clippings and dried sprigs of lavender. It became her refuge within the refuge. Life on the farm resumed its rhythm, but it was subtly altered now. A shared breath between two people no longer bound by obligation, but by something steadier. Emma and Alex worked together in a quiet synchronicity that needed no rehearsal. She took over more tasks, managing the chickens entirely, expanding the vegetable beds, organizing the pantry with a method only she understood. The house began to bear her fingerprint. Curtains she sewed from old linen softened the sharp edges of the windows. A second-hand couch from the thrift shop in town found its place beneath the living room window. Alex said little about the changes, but he never moved anything she'd set down, and that was how she knew he welcomed it. Spring gave way to early summer, and with it came a new energy. The farm pulsed with life. Bees thrummed around the bloomin' orchard. Tomato vines climbed their stakes with greedy fingers. The goat gave birth to 2 wobbly-legged kids, and Emma watched with tears in her eyes as they took their first trembling steps. There was something sacred in the continuity of it all, and how life insisted on renewing itself, even after silence, even after grief. One morning, as Emma knelt in the garden to tie back the growing bean plants, she felt a soft rustle behind her. Turning, she found Alex holding a tray with 2 glasses of lemonade, condensation slick on the rims. "It's getting hot," he said, setting the tray down beside her. She smiled up at him. "You just want an excuse to stop weeding." "Maybe," he admitted, sitting cross-legged in the dirt beside her. "But I did make the lemonade." It had become like this between them, ease threaded through the days like a song. They didn't talk much about emotions, but their silences grew richer with meaning. When Emma laughed, it was with her whole body. When Alex touched her hand, even briefly, she felt it for hours. Their affection bloomed slowly, like everything else on the farm, patient and grounded, with no need for declarations. It was not a sudden spark, but a steady flame. In the evenings, they sat together on the porch steps, watching the fireflies. Sometimes he read aloud from one of the old paperbacks in the hallway bookcase, his voice steady and low. Other times, she worked on sewing curtains for the barn room while he sanded a new gatepost. There was comfort in their companionship, not in grand gestures, but in small consistencies. He always passed her the mug with more sugar in it, just how she liked. She remembered to leave his tools where he could find them. It was a language, unspoken but deeply understood. When the local librarian, a bright-eyed woman named Janet, offered Emma a part-time job helping to organize the children's reading program, she hesitated at first. The idea of re-entering town life, of being visible in a way she hadn't been in months, brought a familiar pang of uncertainty. But Alex had simply said, "You'd be good at it." And that was enough. She took the job, and it became another piece of her healing. At the library, she set up a story corner, decorated with handmade cushions and strings of paper stars. She read aloud to small groups of children whose giggles filled the quiet corners of the building with warmth. She cataloged new arrivals, created displays with care, and fell in love with the soft, rustling hush of pages and whispered curiosity. With her first paycheck, she bought fabric to make new curtains for the kitchen, and a modest second-hand couch she found at the town's consignment store. She and Alex hauled it back together, laughing as it got stuck in the narrow front doorway. That night, they sat on it for the first time with mugs of tea in hand, her feet tucked beneath her, his boots kicked off and muddy by the door. It felt like home. Still, for all the gentleness of their shared life, there was a tension that neither of them addressed directly. Not discomfort, but anticipation. a kind of weight in the air as though both knew the shape their feelings were taking but were hesitant to name them aloud. Emma sometimes caught Alex looking at her when he thought she wasn't watching, his expression unreadable but not guarded, just quiet, thoughtful. She didn't push, she didn't ask, but she felt it too, the slow unfurling of something tender and real. The room in the barn transformed steadily. She lined the windows with jars of wildflowers and painted the walls a soft shade of cream. She began to write again, not just in scattered journal entries, but in full pages, memories, reflections, scenes that might become stories someday. She didn't show them to anyone. She didn't need to. It was enough to know her voice was still there, waiting patiently all this time. One evening, as the air turned cooler and the sky bled lavender and rose over the hills, Alex found her sitting on the porch with a basket of harvested herbs in her lap. He stood beside her without speaking for a while, then finally sat down, resting his elbows on his knees. "You've done a lot here," he said after a moment. Emma smiled, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "It's done a lot for me." He nodded. "The house, it feels different now. Lighter?" She looked at him, her voice soft. "That's how I feel, too." He turned toward her then, and there was something in his eyes that made her breath catch. Not urgency, not pressure, just presence, steady and clear. "I don't know what this is between us," she said, the words coming unbidden but not unwelcome. "But it's the most real thing I've ever known." Alex reached for her hand, his fingers warm and sure. "It doesn't have to be defined to be true," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat like that until the stars emerged. Summer deepened. The garden exploded with color. The first tomatoes ripened on the vine, warm from the sun. The fields stretched golden beneath the sky. The goats grew bold and mischievous. The orchard hummed with bees, the air thick with the perfume of ripening fruit. And in the center of it all, Emma stood taller, more certain of herself than ever. The girl who had once escaped in a storm of silk and fear had not disappeared. She had grown into something else entirely. Not perfect, not finished, but real, rooted, resilient. The life they were building wasn't grand. There were no chandeliers, no press releases, no public affirmations of success. But every morning, when the sun spilled across the fields and into the kitchen, when Alex poured her coffee before heading out, when she watched the steam curl from the mug and heard the hens begin their clucking chorus, she knew that this quiet, steady, chosen life was everything she had ever wanted. And it was only just beginning. The morning of June 24th began like so many others had in recent months, with the light arriving soft and slow through the sheer curtains Emma had stitched herself, painting the floorboards in hues of gold. Outside the window, birds stirred the orchard into song. The goats in the pasture stretched in lazy arcs, and the hens had already begun to scratch their curious trails across the yard. But inside, within the old farmhouse that had grown to know her scent and steps, there was a quiet sense of expectancy. A weightless pause, like the moment before the first drop of summer rain touches warm ground. She rose without haste, wrapped in the gentle comfort of familiarity, and padded barefoot into the kitchen. The kettle was already warm, Alex having lit the stove before heading out to feed the animals. She filled it and set it to boil, her hands moving through the practiced rhythm of morning. In the distance, the thud of the barn door reached her ears, followed by the low murmur of Alex's voice speaking to the horses. It had been a full year since that rain-soaked afternoon when she had stepped out of a train into a world she didn't know. Since then, her days had folded into each other, not like repetitions, but like pages in a story that was finally being written with her own hand. She poured the tea and stepped out onto the porch, tucking her feet beneath her on the porch swing. The old wood creaked softly beneath her, and the breeze kissed her bare shoulders as she sipped. Her eyes wandered across the land, the rows of green vegetables in the garden, the sturdy fence she and Alex had mended in April, the wildflowers she'd scattered behind the shed blooming defiantly between stones. Each piece of this place bore a fingerprint now. Not just his, hers. The porch door opened behind her, and Alex stepped out, brushing dirt from his palms. He glanced at her, and for a moment neither spoke. There was no need. Their silences had become sacred, filled with all the things they understood without language. "You're not working today," he said after a while, not quite a question. Emma smiled faintly. "Not at the library, no. Janet insisted I take the day off." He nodded and leaned against the post, arms crossed, one boot resting against the railing. "She's a smart woman." They remained like that for a time, each breathing in the soft hush of the morning, until finally Alex straightened, cleared his throat, and motioned with his chin toward the old tree near the creek. "I've got something to show you." Emma tilted her head, curious but unbothered. "Now?" He nodded. She stood, left her mug on the windowsill, and followed him across the field. The grass was warm beneath her feet, and the sunlight pooled in patches where the shade broke. When they reached the tree, she paused. A string of colored ribbons fluttered gently from the branches, and beneath them stood a small wooden bench she hadn't seen before. It was freshly built, the grain still clean and pale, the joints tightly fitted. Her gaze swept over it slowly, heart catching in her throat. "You made this?" she said softly. Alex didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned and reached into his back pocket, pulling something small and dark. When he stepped toward her, his hand opened to reveal a box, simple, unpolished, hand-carved. Inside, nestled in soft cloth, sat a ring, a narrow silver band adorned with a single small stone. Nothing extravagant, but utterly, heartbreakingly real. Emma stared at it, her chest rising and falling with something between disbelief and certainty. Alex didn't kneel. He didn't make a speech. He only looked her in the eye, steady as ever, and spoke in a voice that held every truth he'd ever shown her with his hands. "I saw what he never did," he said. "I saw the fire in you, the strength in your silence, the beauty in what you carry. I don't want perfect, Emma. I just want real. I want this, with you." Her eyes blurred, not from sorrow this time, but from the sudden, overwhelming knowledge that she was truly seen. Every scar, every fracture, every crooked seam. He had seen it all, and he had stayed. She couldn't speak, not at first, only nodded and nodded again, her breath coming in tiny, trembling bursts. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes. 1,000 times. Yes." They stood together beneath the tree as the breeze rustled the ribbons above their heads. And when Alex slipped the ring onto her finger, it felt less like a proposal and more like the closing of a circle. A beginning, forged in kindness and built on soil and patience and shared work. The wedding came 2 weeks later. There was no grand venue, no string quartet, no ornate seating chart. Just the porch of the farmhouse draped in wildflowers and laughter, the long wooden table dragged into the yard, and the neighbors who had grown to love her for her grit and her warmth. Janet from the library brought cookies shaped like books. The elderly couple down the road gifted a quilt stitched with the names of all their farm animals. Children ran barefoot through the garden, and the goat tried to eat someone's bouquet. Emma wore a dress she'd sewn herself, simple, ivory, with tiny embroidered daisies along the hem. Her hair was down, unpinned, curls tumbling freely down her back. She stood beneath the oak tree with her hands wrapped around Alex's and eyes full of sunlight. They exchanged vows they wrote together, spoken softly enough that only the trees heard every word. When it was done, the guests clapped, and someone popped open a bottle of homemade cider. There were no flashbulbs, no reporters, no curated social media posts, just real people, real soil beneath their feet, real love rising between them like a morning sun. That evening, as the last guests wandered home, Emma and Alex sat on the steps of the porch, their shoulders brushing, watching the fireflies begin their nightly dance. He passed her a mug of tea, and she took it, resting her head against his arm. "You okay?" he asked, the same words he'd spoken to her that first night, a lifetime ago. "I am," she said, smiling softly. "More than okay." He reached for her hand, now bearing the silver ring, and kissed her fingers. Their life afterward was not dramatic. It didn't need to be. The seasons turned, the goats grew fat and lazy. The library expanded its reading corner thanks to Emma's grant proposal. The garden doubled in size, and the farmhouse, once quiet and lonely, now sang with life. Sometimes Emma still woke from dreams where she was back in her old world, where her hair was tightly pinned and her shoes clicked on marble floors. But those dreams never frightened her anymore. They reminded her of how far she had come. She and Alex built a new shed one weekend, and they bickered over the best way to brace the beams. When the hammer slipped and bruised his thumb, she kissed it out of habit, and he muttered something about her being more dangerous than the tools. They laughed, and the sound carried out over the fields like a flag in the wind. She wrote, often now, at the desk in the barn room, not just reflections, but stories, about girls who ran away and found themselves not in castles, but in rows of beans and patches of wild mint. She never worried whether the stories would be published. The writing itself was enough. One evening, after planting a second rose bush near the porch, Emma stepped back and looked at the farmhouse. It was weathered and crooked in places. The paint on the shutters peeled each summer. The porch leaned ever so slightly to the left, but to her it was more beautiful than any estate she had ever known, because it held truth, because it had grown with her, because she had built it not out of escape, but out of choice. She turned to find Alex behind her, holding a pair of dirty gloves and smiling at the sight of her standing barefoot in the soil. "Still planting?" he asked. "Always," she said. And together, under the pink dusk sky, they walked back inside, into their home, into their life, into whatever came next. It was not perfect, but it was theirs. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe for more. Check out our other videos and share this one with someone who loves a good story.